Texas is big, it's bold, and it loves to tell its own story. But underneath the cowboy hats and barbecue is the three C's: conquest, colonization, and conflict. A story that didn't start with the Alamo or end with the U.S. waving overhead. This is the story of how Texas became Texas, and it starts long before the word Texas even existed. Before there were missions, forts, or ranches, there were the Caddo, Karankawa, Jumano, Apache, and Comanche. These weren't just random tribes. They had religions, governments, economies. They traded obsidian, hunted buffalo, and honored the rivers and stars. Some, like the Caddo, built temples and had priestly classes. Others, like the Karankawa, moved with the seasons, fishing and hunting. These societies were matrilineal, communal, and deeply tied to the land. This is the Texas that Spain, and later Mexico, and then the United States tried to control. And each one had their own motives, methods, and justifications for doing it. The Spanish arrived in Texas in the late 1600s, and they weren't here to make friends. They were here to expand the empire, spread Catholicism, and make sure France didn't get any funny ideas about the land. Spain's approach? A combo meal of religion plus military plus control. They built missions, religious outposts run by friars, and presidios, which were basically forts with soldiers. The goal was simple: convert indigenous people, make them civilized, and absorb them into the Spanish system. Indigenous communities were pressured to abandon their traditions. No more animism, no more ceremonies, no more independence. They were taught Spanish, Catholicism, farming, and labor. And this wasn't a polite request. It was forced assimilation, backed by soldiers and priests. The Spanish saw this as a divine mission, their duty to bring God and order to the frontier. But to the native peoples, it meant loss of land, culture, and freedom. The missions did create a legacy in place names, ranching, and religion, but they also laid the foundation for centuries of conflict. And then, just as Spain was starting to lose its grip, Mexico declared independence in 1821. Now, Texas belonged to Mexico, but they had a problem. Barely anyone lived there, and worse, the U.S. was right next door and growing fast. So, it's 1821. Mexico is newly independent from Spain, and Texas is now Mexican territory. But it's a problem child. Vast, empty, vulnerable to native raids and U.S. expansion. Mexico had two major goals: populate the frontier and keep the Americans out. The solution? A classic case of if you can't beat them, invite them in. Enter the empresario system. Mexico offered land grants to people called empresarios, who could bring in settlers. The most famous? Stephen F. Austin, aka the father of Texas. In 1825, he got permission to bring 300 families to settle the land. These became the Old 300. But there were conditions: convert to Catholicism, become Mexican citizens, and obey Mexican laws. In theory, this would build loyalty. In practice, not so much. Most settlers came from the southern U.S. They brought cotton, Protestant values, and enslaved people, despite Mexico's growing discomfort with slavery. Settlers ignored religious requirements, barely integrated into Mexican society, and still spoke English and followed U.S. customs. Meanwhile, Mexico was struggling to enforce its own laws. The frontier was too far, the government was too weak, and the settlers were too many. By 1830, Mexico tried to crack down, banning further U.S. immigration into Texas, but it was too late. The Anglo-American population kept growing, and with it, the tension. So, why were Americans so eager to move to Mexican Texas? Simple: land. In the U.S., land was getting expensive and crowded, especially in the South. But in Texas, you could get acres and acres of fertile soil for practically nothing. It was the ultimate reset button. Start fresh, grow crops, make money, and for some, escape debt or leave behind political or social baggage. Cotton was king, and with cotton came slavery. Many settlers didn't just want land. They wanted to bring enslaved people to work it. This clashed really hard with Mexico's growing anti-slavery stance, but settlers found loopholes like calling slavery indentured servitude for life. It was slavery by another name. But economics wasn't the only motive. This was also about manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was meant to expand westward all the way to the Pacific. Anglo settlers saw themselves as racially and culturally superior to both Mexicans and native peoples. They believed Texas should belong to the U.S., so even though they were living in Mexico, their loyalty was drifting elsewhere. They came for land, yes, but also for power, control, and the right to build a society that matched their values, including slavery and self-rule. And when Mexico tried to tighten its grips, these settlers pushed back hard. Each group that colonized Texas had its own playbook for control. For the Spanish, it was top-down. Everything ran through Mexico City. They used missions and military forts, convert the locals, guard the land, repeat. It worked, sort of, but it was slow, rigid, and ignored local realities. Indigenous resistance grew, Spain's grip weakened, and eventually it all collapsed. Then came Mexico, and they flipped the script. Their system was more decentralized. Local officials had more power. They relied on empresarios like Stephen F. Austin to do the hard work of settlement. This created really fast growth, but also a lot of chaos. Settlers often ignored Mexican laws, and the more they settled, the more they acted like Americans. And finally, the Anglo-Americans. They wanted local autonomy. Their own rules, their own courts, their own way of life, which sounded great until it clashed with Mexican authority. And once that happened, the settlers didn't compromise. They rebelled. Tensions boiled over. Mexico tried to crack down. The settlers pushed back. In 1835, the Texas Revolution exploded. A year later, Texas declared independence. And a few years after that, it was annexed by the United States, setting the stage for a war with Mexico. So, what did this all mean for the people who actually lived here? Texas became a place where cultures collided. Spanish, Native, Anglo, and later African. Sometimes they mixed in language, food, ranching, but more often, they clashed. The mission system tried to erase Native culture. Anglo settlers brought slavery and took indigenous lands. Mexico's ideals of citizenship and equality were largely ignored. Over time, enslaved labor exploded in East Texas, especially in cotton farming. And despite Mexico banning slavery, settlers found ways to hold on to it, legally and violently. Native communities were pushed off their lands again and again. Some were forced into missions, others were moved west. Many simply disappeared from their maps. Their cultures fractured or erased. But colonization didn't just change who ruled Texas, it changed what Texas was. Spain introduced farming and cattle ranching. Mexico expanded it with land grants and irrigation. Anglo settlers scaled it up, bringing plantation agriculture, slavery, and a booming cotton economy. Texas became a major agricultural player, tied more closely to the U.S. economy than Mexico's. And with this economic power came cultural dominance, Anglo-American values, slavery, and a growing push towards U.S. statehood. Some names you need to know: Stephen F. Austin, the impresario, the land broker, the father of Texas. Without him, there is no Anglo colony in East Texas. Mexican officials, they had the right idea: develop Texas, but they lacked the power to enforce the rules once settlers poured in. And David E. Narrett, a historian who breaks down how U.S. immigration policy, slavery, and colonization collided in Texas, and how that shaped its future. 1825, Austin's contract is signed. Anglo settlement begins. 1830, Mexico tries to stop U.S. immigration. Tensions rise. 1835 to 36, Texas Revolution. Independence declared. 1845, Texas is annexed by the U.S. And in 1846, that sparks the U.S.-Mexico War. Today, Texas is a cultural mashup. You see the Spanish in city names and Catholic traditions, Mexican influence in food, language, and law, indigenous legacies in the land itself, even if their histories are often left out. But the dominant narrative? Anglo-American. The ideals of land ownership, individualism, and racial hierarchy shaped its laws, its economy, and its politics. And the contradictions around slavery, citizenship, and immigration never really went away. They just evolved. Colonization didn't end in the 1800s. Its consequences are still playing out today. In Texas, identity and border debates and who gets to claim land, power, and belonging. The colonization of Texas isn't a simple story of cowboys and flags. It's the story of motives, religious, political, and economic. of methods, missions, land grants, rebellion, and of a legacy of displacement, resistance, and culture clash. Understanding this history doesn't just explain the past, it helps us see the present more clearly. Thanks for watching!